Welcome to Against the Tide, the podcast where extraordinary social changemakers share their stories and their wisdom. Against the Tide is a celebration of courageous women who create lasting impact by daring to forge their own path. We'll dive deep into powerful themes such as the complexity of identity and how it influences the choices we make, embracing change even when it feels uncomfortable, and how breaking free from labels can unlock your true potential. Join me, Jo Metcalf, to hear stories of incredible women who, by swimming against the tide, prove that extraordinary things can happen. This episode features Natsayi, CEO of Natsayi. Welcome, Natsayi. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your story. I've heard so much about you from my producer, Louise. I'm excited to see where this conversation goes. Today, we're going to talk about your journey, your passion for justice, and the moments you've swum against the tide. Shall we begin?
Yes, thanks for having me, Jo.
Excellent. Can we start by talking about your early years and how it shaped your choices?
So I grew up in Essex in the 90s. And then obviously into the noughties in a town called Chelmsford, which I painfully describe as a bit of a nondescript town, which isn't fair, but that's how I experienced it. To Zimbabwean parents as a second generation immigrant with three other siblings. We grew up in a council house in Essex, and I have to say it was completely unfit for human habitation, if I'm completely honest. And those circumstances were brought out of the breakdown of my family, my parents' marriage. So I grew up with my mum as a single mum, my three siblings in a 3-bedroom house in the middle of Essex, with an environment that I grew to realise was, as I said, not really safe for children to be growing up with. We had, black mould on the walls, cracks in the ceilings, no central heating for years, no carpets actually across the entire house, bare wood floors with nails coming out of them, all sorts of things. But you don't realise these things are unusual when you're a child. You just get on with it and you just live and you experience life. So I had this really happy childhood, but in this kind of context, this environment that was clearly not appropriate for children, but it was where we were and we made the most of it. My mum made the most of it and we never realised we didn't have a lot of things until we grew up. I think 90s Essex was also for me defined a little bit by the resurgence of the far right as well, and seeing sort of popping up in my local neighbourhood and around my local neighbourhoods as I moved through the town. Random EDL posters, people with EDL hoodies on the rise of the BNP, UKIP office opposite my primary school. So these kind of tensions were also present in my upbringing, alongside this very joyous upbringing I had in my home. Growing up in Essex was interesting during the 90s or the noughties for sure, and being one of only maybe 3-4 black families specifically in the kind of vicinity of where we grew up was obviously quite potent as an experience, but there was so much joy mixed in with all of this complexity at the same time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And how has that informed your choices?
Significantly. I think growing up in that environment, and also growing up with these complexities kind of being present in your life, of kind of not really having a lot but feeling joyous and abundant, having this immigrant background, your parents from colonial Zimbabwe obviously was known before that time was known as Rhodesia when they were growing up. And your family stories are kind of riddled with complexity, and from the very off, you're talking about, politics at the kitchen table. You're talking about the council at the kitchen table and the issues that are kind of systemically present in your lives, but you're not using this language. You're just talking about life. I think how I grew up, where I grew up, the time that I grew up to, the parents that I was born to, have an enormous impact on how I think about myself, purpose, my life, and the decisions I've made so far. I think I wouldn't have chosen to go down the route of kind of working in the kind of social impact space had I not had that upbringing. Politics, storytelling, change, justice, all of those things were part and parcel of how we thought about the world, how we communicated with one another, how we understood ourselves in the world, and how I understood myself in the world. And then also this kind of passion that I have for both justice and storytelling, I think kind of emerged from those experiences of, again, seeing my mum kind of battling systems to kind of get us what we needed and wanted. So at that kind of micro personal level in the UK context. And then, as I've said, kind of understanding more about myself and ourselves as a family and our history through the lens of like huge kind of colonial, decolonial, political movements and things like that our families were part of, has really massively shaped how I think about things, both at that kind of international and then regional and then very much personal level.
You must see a resemblance of what's happening at the moment as well with what's going on now in terms of what you're describing there. So history sort of repeating itself,
100%,
isn't it? Yeah.
100%. And I think, we can take whichever way you want to, I'm going to read into what you're saying a little bit there and take a bit of creative license with what you might be saying. But I think it's not surprising that we're seeing another resurgence of the far right and, the rise of populism in the UK. And it's terrifying and it's familiar. And it's familiar for so many people who are like me in particular, seeing these kind of waves of hate really popping up over, in quick succession over the last 10, 20, 50 years. You can stretch that timeline out if you would like to. But I think we need to really get to grips with the fact that this is cyclical and it isn't going to go away just because we want it to. I didn't think maybe in the noughties, when I was seeing all of this and was able to see what's going on, understand what these people are saying and what it means for all of us, I didn't necessarily think we'd be back here, seeing myself in my 30s talking about this. I didn't think that, but we have to do something about it. Similarly, if we can, look internationally, we're in the middle of watching, in effect, a genocide, and we're all watching it on our screens. And so questions of colonialism, of imperial expansion, all of these things also alive right now, not just in Palestine but elsewhere. So yeah, definitely there are cycles we need to get a grip on, for sure.
You've achieved success and seniority early in your career. Could you share some context about how and why you ended up where you are today?
So, and I talk about this with my friends and peers. They encourage me not to say what I'm about to say, which is that it's all by accident. It was all one big mistake. And, none of it was by design, but I don't think that's strictly true. I think all of this stems from having a sense of being impatient to kind of shift things within organisations that I found myself in, but then also being trusted by other leaders to kind of just take a bit of license and kind of get things done from quite early on in my career. So, straight out of university, I had a choice. I could take an internship a journalism internship with a huge company. And the second choice was stepping into the charity sector and working for one of the biggest UK charities, Barnardo's at the time. And I had this sort of crossroads, and I chose the charity sector even though I definitely couldn't afford to work for free, which is what it meant, and had 3 other jobs to kind of make that happen. But what I found as I moved into that space is I felt I knew absolutely nothing. I had no skills really, and I was learning as I was going. But there were particularly women in that first experience of the working world who saw something, and I'm not sure what it was, but they saw something in me and gave me loads of bandwidth to just explore questions that I had, ideas that I had about how things could be different, could be changed, how we could connect more across like the silos of the organisation and do things differently. And those initial experiences have been given a lot of space to kind of try things, test things, grow things with very little positional power, gave me this confidence that I could do that again and again and again in every other space that I was in. So that led to then working in a much bigger international NGO, Save the Children, my next step. And I had many roles in that organisation. And I think my ability to build a groundswell around a particular challenge or a change was what led me to get sort of into the place where I could be seen as a competent leader later down the line and take on those chief executive roles or take on the chief of staff role that I took on while I was there. But all of that was demonstrated through roles in which I had no positional power whatsoever. And I'm more than happy to explain a bit more about what I'm talking about there. But taking risks and others seeing something in you and giving you a bit of space to kind of try things and test things and grow things that really change organizations from the inside, was part of the journey towards me getting there. And I try and take that with me in terms of my leadership, and giving people space to kind of get things done is something I was blessed with, and I try and give it to other people.
Amazing. How would you describe your leadership style?
Again, reflecting on this quite a lot lately. I think in those early days, while I was pushing and really trying to shift big behemoth organizations into more progressive spaces, for example, my leadership style was very much kind of people-centered. It was focused on really understanding what is going on for real people in this organization, and how can we use those stories and those truths to encourage, to help us think about what changes need to happen, whether that's cultural, or whether that's in our business models, or whether that's in how we're thinking about our funding practice. All of these things, how do we understand what is materially happening for people and use all of that and that collective wisdom to chart a way forward. So that very people-centric model, and one that is guided by a sense of transparency, complete trust in others, and that what I have to say is no more important than what anybody else has to say, depending on what they're, regardless of where they sit in the hierarchy. Where that's been challenged, and this is where I haven't got a straight answer for this question, which I think is quite clear, is where I found myself actually leading through crisis. So my first chief executive role was leading with a really serious existential crisis for an organisation, and kind of moving it from very much being on the edge of whether it would continue to exist, into successfully selling that organisation on and finding a new way to kind of continue the legacy of that organisation through a merger, all executed within 4 months. The pace of change that was required, the scale of change that I was working with, and the risk, the level of risk within it, and every single decision, every single day, really challenged actually my sense of those kind of core tenets of my leadership style that I just described: the people centricity, the transparency, trust, and collective wisdom as your source of making decisions. All of that was really challenged in that context. And what I learned is that you have to be adaptive. So I think I would maybe describe it as that. It's more of an adaptive leadership style, of which there are kind of some core components that I don't really move from. That is about trusting others. That is about working with rather than against people as best you can, bringing people into the discussion where you can, but recognizing that sometimes when you're in a leadership position, you actually just have to act. And that means sometimes you're not able to be as people-centric as you'd like to be, and you have to find other ways to make sure that value is being expressed in different parts of the challenge that you're working through.
Yeah. And you spoke in there about truth. Can you just expand a little bit on that for me?
Yeah. So I think sometimes when I was working for kind of larger organisations and big kind of institutions, those with like 100-year histories behind them, strong sense of who they are, what they are, like who they are in the world, and also, with 100 years history comes power relations internally and externally that are deeply entrenched and necessary, right, for the survival, ostensibly, for the survival and the continued kind of, journey of that organisation to the next 100 years, or at least that's the position that many take, right? But what you find is that often there are multiple truths in that organisation, and often those multiple truths are not being listened to in service of transformation, or in service of that organisation moving beyond its sense of itself right now and evolving into something else for that next period of time. And what I noticed quite a lot of the time in those organisations was that sometimes senior leaders really were challenged by hearing multiple views and multiple truths, and understanding that actually they are all true. All of those perspectives are true for those individuals who are sharing them. And the question is how you piece them all together into a patchwork that makes sense, and choose and chart a route through that makes sense for your organisation, for the people you want to bring along, and for yourselves as leaders. All of that within that whole milieu. But what I did notice is that quite frequently multiple perspectives were not necessarily met with the kind of the openness or the trust that was really required. And I think there's something about loosely owning this idea of truth in an organisation, and knowing that actually there are multiple and many and various and contradicting truths in any organisation at any one time as a complex system. And your role as a leader is to try and ascertain actually from all of that richness what does it mean for us moving forward collectively? How do we find within that common ground, or how do we find within that interesting perspectives that allow us to move on as an organisation, or allow us to deal with a specific challenge in a way that we couldn't do had we just ignored all of that?
Fascinating. I could talk about that all day, actually. But you also spoke in there around this sense of leading when you're not in a position of power. Could you just dig into that a little bit as well for me? Yeah.
Again, this is something I've been reflecting on quite a lot. And I think as I stepped into explicitly senior leadership positions, it was something it was a real tension that I felt quite viscerally in myself. And I spoke to my coach about it many, many times. The difference between working with no positional power, so no job title, you're not the chief executive, you're not an executive director, you're not an SLT, but driving and moving and shifting organisations and making change and impact regardless, versus having that positional power and, if in effect, the mandate to change. And what that did personally for me, kind of psychologically, and how that expressed itself, is what I'm kind of pointing to there. I had a lot of comfort working in that sort of slightly underdog position, which I think has something to do with lots of things I spoke about earlier in terms of how I grew up and all of those things and what drives me. But I also think it's encouraged me to think differently about what leadership actually is. There is, I think, just thinking about the social sector in the UK, in order to progress, you have to go up the greasy pole, you have to go up the ladder. And what I would love to think about with others and other peers is actually how we build leadership in a more kind of a flatter sort of way, and encourage those who have no interest in being a chief executive, who do not want to be a chief executive, but can be powerful and potent as leaders in other pockets of organisations at whatever scale they would like. How do we unlock that potential? How do you create space for people to express their leadership through those roles, not just requiring people to move up into positions they don't want to be in and they don't have to be in order to affect change? How do we think about that flattening? Because I have seen it for myself, not only in myself, but also in others, and my peers and my friends and my colleagues that came along, aside me, how powerful change can be when it's driven by the bottom or the middle and not by the top, crucially, not by the top. And that's what I'm kind of talking about when I'm talking about leading without positional power and what you can do from that position.
Fantastic, really inspiring. What do you wish someone had told you earlier in your journey?
I think a couple of things. I think, number one, take your time. It's not a race. Take your time to figure out where you're going and why. Not every door that is open is a door that you should walk through. And I've learned that in positive ways and also in quite painful ways, if I'm honest, in my what I would describe as quite a brief career thus far. But I think really being discerning about what you're taking on. Is it for you? Why are you doing this? What's the driver behind it? Are you being honest about why you're taking on that opportunity? Not every door is for you. Think about which ones you walk through, be discerning, and it isn't a race. I think secondly, I would say particularly as a woman of colour, working in an industry that wants to be more diverse and inclusive, but I think is really struggling to make good on that. Find your network, build your network, find the people that you can trust, who are going to support you, and you can also support in turn, that can help you navigate this. And also make sure that you've also got a really diverse network yourself. You will build a network that looks like the industry by virtue of you being in the industry. I think you then have to be really intentional about creating a network that doesn't look like the industry and being supported, because there are things that you're going to experience that are not the same as my colleague, or not the same as a white woman coming through the sector. There are fundamentally things that I experience that other people do not, and vice versa. And so I definitely would have said to myself from a much earlier age, build that network. You're going to need it alongside the rest of your professional network.
Can you tell me more about what it means to swim against the tide for you?
Yeah, I think a couple of things, and maybe it's a little bit cliched, but I just spoke about a minute ago there that, I work in the social impact space in the UK. That means I work with charities, funders, social businesses. I've worked in national charities, international charities, the full kind of gamut of the social sector. And unfortunately, what maps across all of those pockets of the industry is, as I said, this drive to want to be more inclusive and diverse, but actually is kind of we're not quite there. And so whenever I walk into a room, I have noticed that, or I'm on a call, or I'm in a meeting, or whatever, and I've not quite met the person I'm going to meet yet. There is a reintroduction that I often have to do, or an introduction of myself that I have to do that I have not actually seen anybody else have to do. And there's a bit of a sort of having to break down the layers of disbelief that folks are kind of meeting you with to some degree. And it's not coming from a place of malice, but they're just surprised to see you, number one. I'm being perceived as potentially quite young, or I'm being perceived as, oh, this is interesting. I've not seen someone in your position who just so happens to be a woman of colour, or just happens to be a black woman, for example. It's still quite rare. That is a big part of how my journey through and into leadership has been shaped, by sort of trying to navigate the expectations of others, but also trying not to be consumed by this idea that I'm an outlier and therefore I have to work twice as hard, blah, 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 all of those things that you hear. But that sense of kind of pushing against, just by virtue of being there, has been a very big part of my kind of career and how I think about swimming against the tide. I think in addition to that, and these two things sit together, I think, I found myself, particularly in those roles where I wasn't in a position of power, but able to make and pushed to make quite significant change in organisations I was in, being that change agent alongside a couple of others, and trying to shift quite entrenched organisations into more progressive positions. Those two things, my identity and then also wanting to do that within these kind of quite rigid institutions, have definitely kind of created this sense of kind of pushing against rather than working with. And that's not all negative. There's something about that kind of working against the grain that can also be really powerful. It is difficult. But for me, it's also sometimes very telling. If you are pushing against the grain, it gives me a sense that actually what you're doing is potentially worth it, or is going to lead to something potentially transformational, because it is by virtue not the same as whatever it is that exists already.
Yeah, fantastic. How have you navigated those systems that resist that change that you're trying to drive?
It's a really good question. Perhaps I'll use an example just to kind of bring it all to life a little bit. So in my time at Save the Children, I was there for 6 years, Save the Children UK. I'm sure people will know, but it's one of the largest NGOs in the country, and also in the world more broadly. Thousands of staff, internationally kind of federated. They wouldn't refer to themselves as federated, but an international organisation, multiple boards, multiple CEOs across this huge kind of collection of Save the Children's around the world. I worked in the UK part of that organisation, the UK impact part, focused specifically on UK child poverty, and then ended up as Chief of Staff, working in the CEO office next to the Chief Executive for about a year, and then moved on after that. In the time, the kind of first 4 years of being there, the organisation was going through quite a public reckoning around misogyny and harassment, unfortunately, which was experienced by many women in the organisation at the hands of two very, very senior members of staff, who had both left by the time I'd arrived. But there was this resurgence of these cases, which thrust the organisation into a real crisis. Government funding was pulled, which had an overnight impact, and they were forced, in effect, to do a kind of independent inquiry into workplace culture. That framing of that inquiry was definitely right, in that it was focused on experiences of women in the organisation, and folks who were socialised as women in the workplace. And what was referred to then as workplace incivility, so the full spectrum of harassment through to kind of incivility, as they were referring to it. But the framing of that report completely erased two pretty important facets of actually the experience of being in that workplace for so many. It's an international NGO that also works in the UK. It's largely comprised of highly educated, British middle class, upper middle class people. It is not reflective of the wider world that it works in, that it programs in any way, shape or form. And actually, we had women in that organisation, black women in that organisation, black people in that organisation, people of colour in that organisation who felt marginalised being there, working in this international organisation that often worked in places that they are from and spoke languages in relation to, but felt marginalised by that organisation. It's an organisation that's rooted in a history that, depending on how you read it, is read very differently depending on your positionality, where you're born, where you come from. There are really important critiques of humanitarianism in particular, and important critiques of philanthropy and charity, both of which are present in that organisation. And what we did basically was try and make sure that questions of race, class and colonialism were included in the framing of that workplace incivility report. We achieved that by creating quite a groundswell. We had to bring a lot of people with us, build like power of those individuals who felt very, very marginalised in that organisation. There was a huge amount of risk for them speaking up about their experiences, and also not wanting to pit that experience against the experience of women who had been harassed, which was a significant challenge, but find a way to connect the dots between those challenges. It's really challenging while being effectively nobody managers in the organisation, and women of colour at that who were leading it. Through all of that, the entire organisation resisted where we were coming from. We were challenged as kind of divisive, that we wanted to divide rather than to bring us together, and that we had, another agenda. And over time, we just had to go at it, like consistently over time. It took months and months and months of building trust, both with the group of staff who were relying on to tell their stories, to add colour to what was really happening and to draw those connections between our colleagues' experiences of sexual harassment and other forms of harassment and bullying, alongside actually their experiences, many of whom were women, of racism, of incivility on the basis of difference, of all of these things, and actually how they're connected. And we had to work quite hard to kind of build those stories and tell them and build connections that started to demonstrate to the wider organisation actually what we're trying to do here is actually about the collective. It's about the entire health of the organisation and everyone within it now and in the future. We then also had to push quite a lot at the higher level of the organisation, so working with the board and the CEO. We are many, many, many rungs below that level at this time. And again, that was about, finding ways to shoehorn and platform ourselves at all staff meetings, connecting with strategy and finding the way in to have a conversation that connected with wider organisation goals, thinking about actually the values of the organisation. How do we tell a story that connects and actually is undeniable? How do we connect this to wider policy agendas that we're trying to push in the wider industry? How do we make this relevant to people? How do we make this relevant to executive directors who have goals of their own and need to justify why on earth they'd pay attention to this when they've got these other goals? And so lots of kind of politicking, lots of aligning, lots of finding your allies at different levels of the organisation. And eventually through all of that, finding ourselves in the position, in a few years' time, I think it was about 3 years really, in which these ideas were supplanted into the long-term organisational strategy and were accepted as useful and were reflected at every single layer in every single department and in those department goals. And when you think about the scale of that, within that organisation and its power in the wider world was pretty substantial. But it took so much effort and this sort of blind belief that eventually you would be able to kind of shift the needle on this thinking, to bring people with you. They would come into the consciousness that you're already in and see that it benefits them as well as anybody else.
That's an amazing story, and well done for keep pushing that. How did all that feel when you were trying to push against those structures?
It felt, myself and my friend Tahira, who was the person that I worked with and a really close friend of mine, we were the two kind of pushing this, really, really pushing this alongside others. I think we felt quite fearful, if I'm honest, in your very early stages of your career, in an organisation that is quite political, small p and big P political, with some serious players at the organisation who, have big careers and are, influential in your industry, and you're sort of starting out. So we felt a lot of fear. We didn't know what we were doing necessarily. We didn't know what the ramifications might be. But we also I certainly felt that it was the right thing to do, and felt quite energised by working with others and alongside others, and working, as I say, to build collective power in the organisation in a way that meant we could tell this collective story rather than sort of going it alone as two individuals with an agenda. It felt right, but it certainly felt somewhat frightening. And like a fair amount was at stake for us kind of personally within our organisation and wider. But ultimately it was really energising kind of moving through together and seeing what the influence could be and seeing some of that being taken up, and that's very reassuring. And I think it gives you that energy to do it again somewhere else, but for different reasons.
I get this sense that you're going to keep fighting those battles. So
I think
you're not
annoyingly,
going to give it. You're definitely not giving up. What difficult decisions have you had to make along the way?
Several. So I think I've also been a community organiser as well, and so this is relevant for a number of reasons. And I think prior to kind of stepping very formally into the social sector, would have considered myself as like some sort of radical, which is laughable when I think about it now. But I think the decision to work within institutions that I had robust critiques of were quite, those moments and those decisions were quite challenging, I would say. And maybe for others this seems really silly, but for me, working for a Bernardo's or a Save the Children was like a genuine sort of, I need to talk to my brother about this because this feels like a pretty significant step. There's lots of things about these institutions that I don't agree with, but there's lots of things about these institutions that are really powerful and they're not going anywhere. So how do you shift them? So I feel I made quite a few personally difficult decisions about where I was working and why, and trying to find ways to make sure that I was staying true to the reason why I was working there, and thinking about how you can shift what's not so great about some of these places and what's really powerful about these places and use them to the best of their ability. When you take on senior roles, you unfortunately have to take decisions that have significant impact on people's lives in your teams and in your organisations in service of sort of wider objectives. And again, as someone who has this sort of justice leaning, the sense that you must think about people first, and you must kind of consider what the wider ramifications of your decisions might be on people's lives or your wider organisation, etc. I think being in senior leadership positions, well, you have to make that decision. You need to cut that team. You need to think about the business model, etc. You need to make things work. Has been extremely tough. And I think, as I discussed, kind of that first chief executive role that I took on and moving the organisation through massive crisis, the toss-up, talking to my chair every single day, every single night, and we were fretting over the impact on the people that we worked with, the people in my team who I knew everything about. I knew what was going on in their personal lives. I know the challenges they face financially. I knew the complexities of their lives because that's how I approached my work. And yet we still had to make decisions that were really challenging. And I don't think, no matter how progressed or mature I become in my leadership, I don't think I'll ever not find that difficult. But yeah, I think moving through a crisis in an organisation is really hard on everyone. Really, really challenging on everyone, but really difficult when you're the person that needs to make the call as well.
Yeah, that must have been really hard. What keeps you driving through that and pushing against that tide?
I think a sense that things will change and that I can be part of it if I'm in it. Does that make sense? So I could step out, I could choose to do something else, I could find a way to work that maybe requires a little bit less of myself. But I know ultimately I would still always be thinking in the back of my head, what more could I be doing? How can I be part of the change I would like to see, whether that's to do with some of the things I've spoken about leadership and diversity in the social sector and what that truly looks like, not just representation, bums on seats. We can have as many women, as many black and brown people in leadership as we like, but if the structures and the systems haven't changed whatsoever, we are where we are and just in a more toxic place, in my opinion. But divesting from engaging in that work I can't. I don't think it's possible for me to do that. I personally don't think I can do that. And so this sense of actually, if I want to see things change, I also have to be part of that. I need to have some skin in the game, and I need to take some risk in service of that broader aim. And that's part of me being here. The part of me being in any seat from this point onward is to do that, is to have some sort of positive impact. I think also continuing to work in the social sector more broadly, as we spoke about at the top of the conversation, we are at a time where there is a lot of work to be done, and we need good and brilliant people to kind of go the long term and put in the kind of the miles to help us get to somewhere else and somewhere more progressive as a nation, as a world, more broadly. And again, I think the rent I pay for kind of being here is finding ways in which my day-to-day, my livelihood, my job, and how I spend my time is in service of something better, and finding all the different ways in which I can express that with all the skills that I have, with all the energy that I have in different ways. And that shows up in lots of different ways in my life, whether that's through my professional life or for the things I do in community, or how I even just show up with my family. It's all part of that, in my opinion. Yeah, and I think that's the only way that I can honour my mother and all the things that she had to navigate in getting us here in the first place. And then also thinking all the way back to the stuff I was speaking about earlier about, you know, my heritage and the fact that I'm only here because other people literally fought for my ability to be here, have died for my ability to be here, to be this person, to exist. And I need to make good on that too in whatever ways I can find possible.
Amazing. You come across very confident, very driven. Do you ever get doubt and wonder why you are doing what you do?
I find that really funny because I feel that my whole personality is doubt. I was doubting myself. A bit like, you know, we spoke a while ago about leadership styles, right? I think confidence, as well as this concept that I think is really interesting, I don't think it's static. It's certainly not static for me. I don't always feel confident at all. And on a day-to-day basis, I find myself doubting every second thought, every second decision, everything, constantly. And that's something to work on, for sure. But I also think if that ever disappears completely, I might be a bit worried about it. I feel like there's a level of doubt that is useful and can be generative, I think. But like anything, there's also a shadow to anything, right? And I think, you know, at its worst, that can lead you to inertia. And I've certainly been there, that's for sure, overwhelmed with decision, overwhelmed with the scale of something I need to achieve or do. So no, I don't think I'm constantly confident at all. But I try and work with the doubt more than let it overwhelm me. And I'm also learning to wear confidence when it arrives, with confidence, with comfort, and to own that as well. But to think that confidence and doubt are okay. And like I'm saying, I kind of struggle with both of them in different ways. Have been reframing them in different ways and seeing them as kind of friends rather than enemies in thinking about how I grow as a person. Does that make any sense at all?
Total sense. And this is coming across as a bit of a theme in these conversations. Yeah. So absolutely resonates with me personally as well. So thank you for sharing that. What advice would you give other women who are passionate about justice and change?
Possibly 3 things. Let's see if she can do 3 things today. Number 1, as I said before, find your people. Find your people. And these aren't people that you just agree with, crucially. Not the people who are going to tell you yes, who are going to tell you you're right every time, and share every single dogmatic or beautiful, broad opinion that you have. You need to find people who not only absolutely align with you, for sure, you need those people, but people who are going to tell you about yourself. People who are going to tell you with love and care, you know what, you're probably going about this ever so slightly wrong. Have you thought about X? People who will encourage you through constructive, supportive critique, and people who align with you. You need to find and that's what I mean by find your people. I think it's a spectrum of people, not necessarily a spectrum, but like a bit more of a patchwork of your people. Not just your yes people, they are important, but who is going to challenge you through your journey, whatever that looks like in whatever industry you're in or whatever you care about. I think number 1, find your people. I think number 2, really look after yourself. Really, really look after yourself. And part of that comes with, I think, looking after other people in your life, but definitely look after yourself. Some of the most incredible organisers, leaders, public intellectuals that I am blessed to know in my life, who I think are doing real and important things right now, are also some of the most like selfless people I know. I don't put myself in this camp at all, but what I have noticed about all of them is sometimes they struggle to make space for their own well-being. If you are serious about a life like the life I've just described of the individuals I happen to know, I think really making space for looking after yourself is key. And if you are a woman in leadership in general, again, I think it's just as important. This can be exhausting, it can be beautiful, it can be energizing, but it requires a lot of you. So you've got to find ways to look after yourself.
Yeah, fantastic. If we go back to the start of the conversation where we talked about the rise of the far right again, what are your observations about where we're at now and your hopes for the future?
I think my observations are, and I say this to myself as well as to all of us, is that we should have seen it coming. And some people did see it coming, but we were underprepared. And I think, and what I mean by that is, from my point of view, the left, for want of a better phrase, I think we're underprepared to deal with this. I think civil society is underprepared to deal with it. And then I think about my professional life, I feel the social sector is not prepared. I don't think we are as prepared as we could be to deal with it. And so those are my observations for now, as across the board, not prepared. And perhaps maybe a little bit of us as human beings maybe didn't want to be prepared for something like this. But I think many of us probably could have seen it coming. You know, we've had decades of increasingly disgusting rhetoric actually peddled through the press and through social media and all sorts of things. We've had, you know, leaders happily blowing as many dog whistles as they would like in service of building a supporter base at the expense of other sections of our society. We have seen, you know, so much traction in that space over time and so much normalization of hate-fueled language and action over the years that we perhaps should have seen it coming, whether that's around like migration or anything else. Quite frankly, we've seen the scapegoating, we've seen all of this kind of taking shape through the first years of austerity and now into this kind of period as well. So we should have seen it coming, number one, in my observations, and I think many of us are ill-equipped to do anything about it, to move as quickly as we need to and to take the stance that we need to. Is my view. My hope, though, is that we very quickly shift because we really need to. And again, I count myself in this kind of underprepared space. And what I hope is that we capitalise on all the really incredible things that are actually happening, particularly in places, in real communities, real normal people doing extraordinary things at a local level to build connection, to shift narratives, to change things in their own communities.
And what does real change look like?
I think real change looks like, for me, in the UK, what I would like to see is a politics that works for people. An environment in which debate and conversation is happening at scale across 4 nations of the UK in a way that is healthy, constructive, challenging. Yes, doesn't mean everyone will agree, not at all, we're never going to get there, but at least we are able to have conversations that are about our lives, about change, about transformation of the places that the places that we live in, of our communities, of our country, right, that are rooted in a sense of kind of best intentions as opposed to divisiveness. That we may not agree, but what we're all trying to do here is build something better, new and different. And that requires, I think, real transformation, particularly at kind of the central government level, and then also in our own minds and also in how we behave as individuals. I think we need to see leadership, political leadership in particular, that is reflective of our humanity, that is reflective of who we really all are. And I think at the moment we're really sort of lacking that. And it's not a good, there are few role models being platformed at the moment as to kind of who are demonstrating what that looks like, and that actually you get ahead by doing that, if you want to think about it that way. You win by being human. There's just very little of that, and I think real change actually looks a bit like that to me, and requires more of those individuals to be platformed, and then for us as individuals to be that individual in the kind of spaces that we're in as well.
You've talked quite a bit about system change. Could you just explain that a little bit for our listeners, please?
Yes. So when I say systems change, what I mean by that is transformation at every level of the system, or society is maybe the way that I think about it. So I think about that first starting with individuals and yourself. How does your mind change about any given issue, or I think about this through obviously the lens of kind of social issues in particular. How do you uphold the status quo in relation to those social issues, whether that's around classism or racism or whatever else? Pick your thing. How do you uphold some of these internalized ways of thinking and being that uphold these external structures and systems that keep entrenched issues in place? And how do you then think about, okay, as me as a person, how do I need to change my perspective and the ways I think about things in order to shift them in how I do things, how I enact my ability to influence things as an individual on a day-to-day basis, all the way through to then policies that kind of influence how those institutions, organizations, places kind of function. And then all the way through again to the next layer, we could think about that as kind of government policy, central government policy, and what kind of guides and shapes the kind of decision-making structures or design principles of policy, and then and all the way through. And so when I think about systems change, I'm thinking about all of those interconnected layers.
Fantastic. I think I could chat to you all day, Natsayi, but we're going to have to stop. I feel that's a great privilege to have this conversation. So thank you for choosing Against the Tide to share your story. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Against the Tide, brought to you by Joe Metcalfe and Louise Kavanagh. We're grateful to the team at Sticks and Glass in Leeds and Bison Studios in London, our inspiring guests and wonderful listeners. Subscribe to Against the Tide wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode.